Hello and welcome to the first part of our training on nature-related financial disclosures, developed by the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative in partnership with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. I'm Fiona, a training officer at the UNSSE, and firstly, I'd like to start with a thanks to our partners and supporters, TNFD, UNDP, and ICI, the International Climate Initiative. And of course, a big thank you to you for taking the time to participate in this training. So today's video forms the first part of our training to provide a baseline on some of the key concepts ahead of the live workshop you're going to be joining. And at the workshop, there'll be live Q&A, so make sure to take note of any questions you have as you're watching this video, and we'll be happy to pick those up with you then. We're also going to be testing your knowledge on the key concepts from today's video at the start of the live workshop. So to be sure to pay attention to ensure you're up to speed on all the basics. This training is CPD certified, so to receive your certificate, you're going to need to complete the feedback survey that we'll provide at the end of the live workshop. So don't forget, it's necessary to take part in both parts of the training, i.e. this preparatory video and the live workshop, to be eligible for a CPD certificate. So make sure you join us at a session in follow-up to watching this video if you'd like to get your certificate. And so by the end of this program, these are the goals that we're hoping to achieve together. So firstly, to explain why nature is relevant for business. To be familiar with what resources are available to support management and disclosure on nature. To understand how to identify, assess, and manage nature-related issues. And finally, to identify who requires this information and how to best integrate it into public disclosures. And so in this video, we're going to focus in particular on that first goal, but keep in mind how this fits together with those other three goals that we'll cover later on in the live program. So to help us achieve these objectives, we've developed a 4-module structure. Today's video is focused on our first module, all around understanding context and key principles. In our live workshop, we're going to be covering a further 3 modules, providing an overview of how to align our efforts with key global goals, frameworks, and standards, how to implement the practices and systems we need to identify, assess, and manage nature-related issues, and finally, how to communicate on nature through engaging our stakeholders and reporting to investors. So let's get started, and now I'll pass over to Tiffany to introduce Module 1.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. I'm Tiffany. I'm the SSE Academy head, and it's a real pleasure to be here today with Fiona and with Helen to bring you this first module of our workshop together. Let's dive straight into the content. So today we're going to get started with the first module, Understand, and in this module we look to build a solid foundation of knowledge on this topic, on nature and biodiversity. So in the first unit, to build that solid foundation of knowledge, we want to first cover why nature matters, so why it's critical to act on nature at all scales, and then what businesses should know about nature, the key considerations to get clear from the start in order to understand this topic from a business perspective. So to understand its importance, I think we first need to all get on the same page and understand what exactly we mean by nature. Understanding these specific terms and how they relate directly to our organization is really the foundation for everything that follows in this workshop. So let's just take a minute to get all on the same page. Let's start with the word nature. The definition of nature for the purposes of this workshop with the TNFD is quite simply the natural world, or all naturally occurring living and non-living components on Earth, and the interactions among living organisms, including people and their environment. So then, what is biodiversity? Well, whereas nature is a broad concept, all naturally occurring things like humans and animals and insects and plants and water and minerals, etc., biodiversity is a more specific characteristic of nature. So that specifically refers to the variability among living things and the ecosystems they inhabit. So, when we refer to biodiversity in this workshop, what we refer to is the variability among living organisms from all sources. So, that includes those on land, those in the sea or other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological systems or complexes that they're a part of. This includes diversity within species. So, for example, differences between a bulldog, a Labrador retriever, or a poodle. Also, differences between the species. So, the difference between a cat and a dog, for example. And diversity of ecosystems or the natural environment. So, maybe the differences between the Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert and the Australian coral reef. They all have important characteristics that should be distinct from each other. But what is really important to remember about biodiversity is that this is what makes nature resilient and functional. It's not a nice to have, it's actually a need to have. So, although nature and biodiversity are sometimes used interchangeably by policymakers and regulators, they are different but closely connected concepts, and they have distinct implications as well. Now, those are the only two definitions I'm going to go through as we get started, but please do remember that the TNFD has a really useful glossary that you can use, and you may want to just take a look through that and familiarize yourself with it before our workshop in live workshop. Great. Now we're clear on what we mean by nature and by biodiversity. So let's have a look at the current state of play for nature globally. So on this slide, we're looking at the concept of planetary boundaries. And this is a framework scientists use to understand the environmental limits that we as humans can operate safely in. So in other terms, what limits can we survive in? Think of these boundaries as Earth's life support system, the systems that keep the planet stable, predictable, and habitable. All really good things, I think you agree. In 2025, however, a scientific assessment showed that we've actually already pushed past the limits for 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. This means that if our planet were to go to the doctor right now for its annual checkup, it would leave with some pretty bad news. So you may note here that climate change is just one of the planetary boundaries evaluated. It's true, and I know that climate change and climate-related disclosures are a main focus for many of you. But I think what's important to take away here is that it's not the only thing that's making us vulnerable. There's many other areas of nature that are making us particularly vulnerable right now. And that's why we talk about looking at nature beyond climate. So we need a much more integrated perspective, one that recognizes how biodiversity, land use, freshwater, nutrient cycles, and many other systems are interconnected. And we need to act with real urgency because these systems are already under significant stress. So with that in mind, let's look at this decline in nature we're seeing in more detail. As you can see on the slide header here, multiple ecosystem services are now in decline. So an ecosystem service is simply the benefits that we get from nature, often for free, right? Things like clean water, fertile soil, food, pollination, protection from storms, and even the regulation of our climate. They're the natural systems that quietly support our lives and our economies every day. Now, in 2019, the leading scientific body that assesses the health of these ecosystem services, IPBES, warned in its global assessment that many of these ecosystem services are declining around the world and that we need urgent action to reverse this. For example, they found that extinction rates today are estimated to be between 100 to 1,000 times higher than the natural rate at which species would typically disappear over longer periods of time. Now, this is important because it impacts biodiversity. And if you remember from our definition slide, biodiversity is really essential for nature's ability to adapt and to be resilient. I do suggest taking the time to look at this report and the planetary health check on the slide before you join our workshop. You can find the links in the slide deck, which will be available on our website. But for now, I hope that the message is clear. Nature's ability to support us is weakening, and reversing these trends is urgent. And this isn't only a job for governments. Businesses and financial institutions have a crucial role because they both depend on nature and have significant influence over it. So what do I mean by depend on nature? Do you think your company depends on nature? Well, it's likely to some extent it does, even if you haven't realized it yet. Let's start at the economic scale first. So, whether we think about food production or energy systems, manufacturing, infrastructure, or even digital services, all parts of the economy to some extent rely on the natural systems that provide things like water, materials, energy, and a stable climate. The figures shown here, which are drawn from the World Economic Forum, illustrate to what extent different countries and regions are considered to be moderately to highly dependent on nature. And the key takeaway here being whether north or south or industrialized or developing, all economies are dependent to a significant amount on nature. So you see, nature isn't just an environmental issue, it's an economic foundation. When nature declines, economies become more vulnerable. When nature is healthy, economies are more resilient. Understanding this dependence is crucial for businesses and for financial institutions as they start assessing nature-related risks and opportunities. So the good news is that the world now has a shared plan for how to turn this around. That plan is called the Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF. And this is an internationally agreed set of goals and targets that outline how we can start living in harmony with nature again. You can think of the GBF as the nature equivalent to the Paris Agreement on climate change. It was signed by 196 countries in December 2022, and it's really not just aspirational. The GBF requires countries to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and to follow an ambitious pathway toward a world where people and nature can thrive together by 2050. And within the GBF, there are four long-term goals for 2050 and 23 targets for 2030, all designed to protect and restore nature, use resources sustainably, and ensure that the benefits from nature are shared fairly. So, understanding these global commitments is really essential because they set the direction for future regulation, for investor expectations, and for what good nature stewardship will actually look like for organizations going forward. Importantly for you, this framework will require significant changes to business practices across all sectors because the way business uses land, water, materials, energy directly shapes biodiversity outcomes. So with that, I'm going to pass back to Fiona to talk everyone through what this means to businesses in practice. Thanks, Fiona.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. So, a key point to highlight to get us started on this topic is that a lot of the value that businesses extract from nature today isn't fully priced into their valuation. So, water, clean air, fertile soils, stable weather, these are all essential inputs to businesses. Companies often don't pay the true cost of using or damaging these. So, why does this matter? Well, fundamentally, business and nature are systemically interconnected. And that simply means that the two are linked in a continuous loop. So businesses rely on nature to operate, and we call these dependencies. But at the same time, business activities also affect nature. These are impacts. The diagram here shows how the TNFD represents this relationship. On the left-hand side, you see nature and the services that it provides. And on the right-hand side, you see business. And the arrows show a two-way flow. Businesses depend on nature, but their actions impact nature in return. And when you put those dependencies and impacts together, this is what translates into risks and opportunities for companies. So we've just explored how business and nature are interconnected and how these connections translate into real risks and opportunities. Now let's take that one step further. So nature isn't just an environmental issue, it's a core strategic risk for organizations. Nature-related risks and opportunities directly influence a company's resilience, its strategy, its risk management, and even its financial planning. The figure here is based on work by NGFS, or Network for Greening the Financial System, a global group of central banks and financial supervisors. And they created a conceptual framework to explain how nature loss can lead to financial risks. And at the heart of this is a very simple idea. The future cash flows of business, whether they're corporates or financial institutions, depend on a continuous flow of benefits from nature. And these benefits are the ecosystem services we talked about earlier. So things like water, soil fertility, pollination, and stable weather patterns. And when those services decline, the business models that rely on them become more fragile. But there's a real tension here. Investors and markets are still expecting continual growth and rising returns. And meeting those expectations often increases pressure on nature. And yet the resilience and health of nature, as we've heard, is in decline. So organizations are caught between the near-term push for growth and the need to protect natural systems that make growth possible over the longer term. And so to navigate this, companies need a structured way to understand how nature-related risks show up in their operations, supply chains, and finances. And that's exactly why the TNFD framework was developed, to help organizations bring nature into strategic planning and decision making. So it's important to remember, however, that this isn't just about risk. Nature can also present business opportunities that have positive outcomes for both business and nature. An opportunity doesn't always mean inventing something brand new. It can be as simple as applying what the business already does in a smarter, more sustainable way. And these opportunities can deliver benefits both by reducing negative impacts, but also by creating positive outcomes for nature. And on the business performance side, opportunities show up in several ways. So through markets, as customer expectations shift, companies can access new markets or locations by responding to growing demand for nature-positive products and services. Through resource efficiency, so using less water or fewer materials reduces costs and strengthens resilience, especially in water-stressed regions. Products and services, so there's a growing demand for commercial potential in offerings that restore good nature and generate new nature-positive revenue streams. In capital and financing, so positive nature performance can unlock better financing terms, access to sustainability-linked loans, or improving investor sentiment. And finally, reputational capital. So demonstrating leadership on nature can strengthen brand value and stakeholder trust. And then there are also sustainability performance opportunities. For example, redesigning internal processes to reduce pollution or investing in ecosystem restoration, such as restoring mangroves to protect infrastructure from storms and flooding. And it is important also to say that financial institutions have opportunities as well. They can enable nature-positive outcomes through the capital they provide, the products they design, and the clients they support. So, of course, while nature loss brings real risks, it does also open the door to innovation, efficiency, new markets, and stronger long-term resilience. Okay, so we've covered a lot of information already, so let's take a moment to reflect and test you all. And in this quiz question, I'm going to have a think with you about which industries are dependent on nature. So let's take a few seconds to think about our answer, and you can pause the video here if you need a little bit more time. But which of these industries you see below do you think are dependent on nature? And so the correct answer is A, B, and C. And so the degree of dependency is going to vary by industry and by individual organization, but fundamentally all of these industries, and indeed many others, will have some nature-related dependency. So while the dependencies in sectors such as agriculture may be more obvious, this can be harder to identify in other sectors. And so we'll explore further in our live workshop how businesses can go around assessing this dependency. But for now, let's move on to the last segment of our Understand module. And so I'm pleased to pass on to our colleague Helen at the TNFD to cover this with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen Beddoe and I'm the Education and Training Lead at the TNFD. And so far with Tiffany and Fiona, we've covered the why. In this section, let's look at some of the specific aspects of nature that are important for businesses to understand when they are getting started on this topic. The first concept to cover here is the 4 realms of nature. These are the different components the TNFD uses to define what is part of the living natural world. And as we can see in the diagram, the TNFD's framework is based on 4 realms: land, ocean, freshwater, and atmosphere. Society lies at the center of the 4 realms. This reflects that people are part of nature and not separate from it. The subterranean realm is included within the land, freshwater, and ocean realm, and this is part of the fuller definition of realms developed by the IUCN, which the TNFD definition draws upon. What's important for businesses to keep in mind is that nature-related issues across all 4 of these realms should be considered in assessments when we're talking about nature. So climate change is a global process with one shared atmosphere. And in contrast, nature and the drivers of nature change are location specific. So a business's nature-related dependencies and impacts on nature, which lead to risks and opportunities for the business, these are highly location and context dependent. The risks and opportunities of the business are shaped by both the sector in which the business operates and its geographical footprint. So understanding where a business interacts with nature, both in its direct operations and in its upstream and downstream value chains, is key to being able to identify and manage nature-related issues. And organizations are asked to pay particular attention to any ecologically sensitive locations where their business model or value chain may have an impact or a dependency on nature. Sensitive locations are defined by the TNFD as locations where the organization's assets or activities interface with nature in areas that are in 5 key areas. So this is areas that are important for biodiversity, for example, rainforests, areas that have high ecosystem integrity when nature remains largely intact and untouched by human activity, areas where there is a rapid decline in ecosystem integrity, areas with high physical water risks, experiencing water scarcity, groundwater depletion or flooding, and or areas of importance for ecosystem provision, such as mangrove forests that provide protection from flooding. Organizations need to consider these sensitive locations alongside the locations which present material nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, or opportunities to their organization. And this is in order to filter and prioritize as part of the LEAP approach. We'll discuss this point further in a later module, but what's important to keep in mind at this stage is that location matters when it comes to nature. This figure is from the World Economic Forum's annual risk report, which is updated annually. And it illustrates that we face a systemic landscape of risks which are interconnected, often in surprising or unexpected ways. And here you can see that biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse is linked to infectious diseases, chronic health conditions, extreme weather events, and so on. And business leaders need to navigate this complex set of interconnected risks and opportunities. And what's clear is that nature-related risks connect to and amplify other corporate risks. The declining health and resilience of nature is clearly reflected in risk perceptions, and environmental risks dominate the 10-year horizon of global risks, according to WEF's annual risk report. Business and finance can no longer consider nature as a CSR issue. It is now a central and strategic risk management issue. And given the complex interactions and rapidly evolving landscape of risks, we see that senior leaders are increasingly taking an integrated approach to managing risk. So businesses can start by understanding how their activities interact with and affect nature. And they can respond by addressing the 5 impact drivers. Impact drivers are key factors through which an organization's activities interact with and affect nature. And there are 5 impact drivers of nature change. Climate change, temperature change, drought, flooding, land, freshwater, or ocean use change. For example, the conversion of land for agriculture, like meat or soy production. Resource use, for example, the use of natural resources such as timber, minerals, and fish stocks. Invasive species, the spread of non-native species, which can disrupt local ecosystems, and pollution, the release of harmful substances like plastic, chemicals, and nutrients into the environment. In the TNFD's conceptual framework, impact drivers of nature change can be both positive and negative. For example, emissions reduction, removal of invasive species, or removal of pollutants from waterways. These are all positive examples of nature change. And one impact driver can be associated with multiple impacts. Impacts drive changes to the state of nature. So, for example, greenhouse gas emissions affect multiple ecosystems. And what's clear here is that nature and climate are inextricably linked and need to be tackled together. For example, climate change and the resulting increase in global temperatures is a driver of nature degradation. The increasing frequency and intensity of flooding, wildfires, storms can disrupt the water cycle, alter soil temperatures, and accelerate habitat and wildlife loss. But nature degradation also drives climate risk. So the destruction of forests can accelerate climate change by releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and the destruction of wetlands and mangroves that provide protection against flooding can reduce climate resilience. It's also important to remember that people are part of nature, not separate from it. People, especially Indigenous peoples and local communities, rely on nature for their livelihoods and can play a critical role as stewards in conserving and restoring ecosystems. Societies and economies are fundamentally dependent on ecosystem services such as fresh water provision, pollination, and climate regulation. And these are all vital for business operations and global supply chains. Understanding nature and nature-related issues from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders provides important benefits to organizations. And what is fundamental to understand is that corporates and financial institutions cannot address nature loss by acting alone. So now that we have covered the key points businesses need to understand about nature, I am going to hand back to Tiffany to take us through the key takeaways from this module.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. So let's recap on a few key points we've covered in this video and set up how this connects to our upcoming live workshop. So our first key takeaway really is simple. Every business depends on nature. This isn't just about farming, mining, or fishing. We've shown that all sectors and all regions of our economy and society rely on nature in some way, and that those businesses that are not aware of their impacts and dependencies on nature have a very large blind spot in their risk management practices. The second takeaway here that we hope you learned today is that nature isn't an isolated issue. And also that it is, unlike when we talk about climate change, location specific. We highlighted today that nature is highly interconnected with other important societal issues. Nature-related risks can easily connect to and amplify other major corporate risks, making the global risk landscape indeed highly complex. But also, we talked about how nature is really related to the location. Your exposure to nature-related dependencies, risks, and opportunities is highly dependent on where you operate, your geographic footprint, and your specific sector. So this means understanding your footprint and the nature and biodiversity in those biomes and ecosystems in those areas are essential. So these foundational concepts are key to the next part of our workshop, which we look forward to seeing you in soon. And we'll use it when we work together with our guest speaker to look at how this plays out in practice. If you have not already signed up for the live portion of this workshop, do make sure to do so soon. You can go to the webpage you can see on the screen now and sign up for the next available workshop on this topic that suits your time zone. Also on that same webpage, you can find a number of resources for your learning journey on this topic. If you'd like to take a look at any of the resources we've discussed in this video or read those reports that I suggested you read earlier in this video, you can find links to all of these resources and more in the slide handouts available on the event page for the workshop you signed up to. You may also want to make use of the SSE's model guidance on this topic, which provides a more detailed explanation of all the areas we discuss in our training. So before we sign off today, we want to thank all of our partners that made this training program possible. So first, a really big thank you to the SSE supporters. These organizations have provided an annual voluntary financial contribution to the UN SSE, which makes all of our work possible and sustainable. These official supporters have shown their commitment to sustainable and transparent capital markets. And if you too wish to show your commitment and to become an SSE official supporter, please contact us now at the email address on your screen. We also would like to thank our partners and supporters for this particular training program. Thank you to TNFD and especially to Helen for their partnership and collaboration on this workshop and for being with us for the facilitation for this workshop as well. And this workshop was made possible due to grant funding from the government of Germany, ICI, and the UNDP. Finally, thank you to all of you for taking the time to watch this video. You're now ready to join the live workshop, and we look forward to seeing you online soon.